Okay, so for today's video, I wanted to cover a tool I came across called Robusta. Um, Robusta is essentially a tool that gives you notifications, but also troubleshooting your Kubernetes cluster, right? It does use Prometheus and Grafana as well, or it can for a pre-configured configuration if you want to go that way. But I wanted to break down what the architecture is going to be, what I ran today, and then kind of let you see what Robusta looks like in action, right? So as far as what it does, essentially it has a service, a forwarder. That forwarder will look at your Kubernetes API server if there's any changes. And then if there is any changes as far as monitoring, it will forward that to the runner. And the runner will sit in the same namespace when you do the Helm install. A couple areas that I had issues with in terms of installation, I just noted them here was I'm running on Windows, right? Once I switched over to GKE, it doesn't recommend doing this on Minikube. To get the CLI going as far as the gen config, I had to run the Docker command and then Robusta gen config. And that got me working. Essentially, it generates your YAML file that will be used for what they call syncs. Right now, if you're doing any extract, transform, load, you're likely familiar with Data Factory or having syncs in general as part of logging and forwarding logs. So typically a sync is essentially where you want the context information to go to the notification channel, if you will, right? Some organizations like to use Jira for DevOps. Some other organizations might use Microsoft Teams, Slack. I can't really see anyone using Discord, but who knows? There's a lot of options, and they do have more in-depth documentation that covers that, right? What that looks like as well, right? So I'm going to click over here and show you what's going on throughout the cluster. So I'm in Google Cloud. I launched a cluster called Robusta cluster. And essentially, this Robusta cluster has 5 nodes. I initially started out with 2, but I had to up the memory, right? So just to quickly show you what's going on. Okay, so I have a crash pod that's already being populated. That's a part of the docs, right? And then I do have some pods pending over here. But I essentially had to up my nodes because I was running out of memory, and I was reaching the threshold of my small CPUs. But just to get you familiar on what Kubernetes looks like from a managed standpoint, right? These are some of those out-of-the-box native metrics on their area. So you can kind of see I have the CPU request. I can also go to memory request. So some other areas that from a managed service, the difference of what you're getting rather than local hosting your Kubernetes cluster. And then just quickly wanted to show you some native features to GKE or GCP that I really like. This essentially gives you your vulnerability scanning, right? It also tells you the amount of workloads. If there's any vulnerabilities in concern, right? What those concerns are. So it looks like I got a couple CVEs I need to take a look at. And again, if you wanted to select more, clusters have essentially a unified approach. That's the great thing. It will all live in this Kubernetes engine, right? And essentially in the same UI, right? So if you select a cluster, you can kind of see what that breaks down to. If you have a cluster, you'd have to turn the auditing on, so mine is on. Okay, so now let's show you what this looks like in our shell. So if I do a kubectl get pods, right? Let's run that. So we can see some of those services that we covered. So we have our alert manager, we have our Robusta Kube Prometheus, and a couple other pods here, the node exporter as well, right? Let me clear that. And now let's go up to how that kind of plays out as far as the UI. So the documentation talks about using a crash pod, right? Their crash pod essentially is made to fire off the alerts and show you kind of the visibility of what this is. So notice I'm at platform.robusta.dev. As you install, you have to provide an email, and essentially it will unlock this user interface that you're seeing that I'm interacting with here, right? And also zoom in a little bit. So I can break down alert name. Oh, okay. So we have a couple of grouped events, right? So you can see failed scheduling, warning for pod. I can go to the event stream and then kind of see what that looks like, right? Failed scheduling warning from pod default, and then it gives me an error message, so you can kind of get some more context, right? It will classify the type that you see here as a warning, right? It'll give you a reason and then context about that message along with the time, right? So it's a real neat companion. You can think of this from if you are using Prometheus, right, and Grafana and some of those managed Prometheus, managed Grafana, either or, this can definitely start getting those metrics or the context that it does scrape from those and actually making meaningful notifications to your operations team. So something to consider. And then if I go back to apps, right, let me extend this a little. You can see essentially all the applications I have deployed, right? So I have 43 apps running, or as it calls it, apps in there, right? I can also group by the namespace, so I can see if I'm just concerned about kube system default, right? So it's a really nice user interface, and then I can expand and then get some more information. So the real cool thing is once I load, for instance, what we just clicked on, I can get some of the CPU and memory in here as well, and then I can get this breakdown. So if you can see, it's kind of like a status report. And then I have a couple options, right? I can restart, I can check the logs a little bit further. And if there's any alerts, I will trigger to be here. And then think about this, it even shows kubectl get events, what that breaks down to, right? I can see the YAML file as well. So pretty neat when it comes to just out of the box things that you can do, right? I'll go back in this. And let's see, let's go back to, no, let's go to jobs. So I don't have any jobs, right? If I did, he'll have running, completed, failed, right? And then I can check on my nodes, right? So remember I have 5 nodes and they're all onboarded on here, right? But I can see essentially what's their external IP, what's their internal IP, what memory total is there, things of that nature. And then as far as this comparison tool, this essentially can look at how you're comparing to other namespaces or even clusters, right? Think about this from a management perspective. So you can see here, I can essentially get even a better bird's eye view about the comparison from this specific service to another service, right? So if I'm quickly trying to identify, so it's going to just queue this. So then if we're kind of looking for that specific service real quickly, right, I can do runner, and then I can get information on runner that I would need, right? So CPU limits, things of that nature, what volumes are attached to it as well. And then as far as health, it says they're working on this feature here, but you can see health as far as your nodes, your apps, your pods, and then you can even open this up a little bit further here. And then we can see that crash pod, right? So let's say we wanted some more information on that. We'll click on that little graphical icon, and then we can pull some more data. As you can see here, back off warning, restarting failed container in the crash pod, debug, and then crashing pod in this namespace priority high. Okay. So we can see it's running, right? But we know that this is essentially restarting. So we can even investigate the YAML itself, right? Okay, get X125, it's running on a busy box, okay. So a lot of detail you can grab from here, right? Obviously, when you're thinking about the health of your cluster, especially for your end users, you want to make sure you have quick visibility, right? And then also I can go even a step further to look at my nodes, kind of what's being used, what's not being used in terms of memory. And then you can see kind of what the events are unfolding in a lot more nice fashion. If you're like me, you're using the CLI quite a lot to interact with kubectl, so this is a nice area that likely some of your users that are not too familiar can get familiar with some of the applications that you're running, right?